All right, everyone. Hello, hello. This is West Productions 100 here, bringing you a live stream here on a video from Monsieur Z or Mr. Z because my French is not very good, assuming it's even French. But I follow this guy on and off, for years, and sometimes I want to make response videos to him and other people, and so he recently made a video. This is the same day it came out. It's the same day I'm responding to this in the live stream, and it's called "Will the United States Become a Hispanic Country by 2060?" And I will say that I did get a chance to watch the video before doing this, so I do have some idea what he said here. But I won't get into more on that right now. And what I'll do is instead is I'll just watch it, and we'll go from there. All right, hang on with me, folks.
The United States has seen a massive surge in its Hispanic population since the turn of the century and even saw this building up in the immediate decades prior. This population growth is attributable to both a significant rise in immigration, both legal and illegal, as well as a notably higher birth rate among Hispanic Americans when compared to the rest of the domestic population. Whether you characterize Hispanics as a racial or ethnic identity, both of which being somewhat imperfect descriptors, it's
Okay, so right there, that's the one thing that definitely popped out to me was he described Hispanic or Latino as either he's like whether it's up to you. He's like it's up to you whether it's going to be a racial thing or an ethnic thing, and and they're both definitions are imperfect. And to me, it's like he says that, and I thought to myself like, okay, like on what grounds do you have to say that? It's especially for the racial part because all the things I've read about when it comes to the definition of Hispanic or the definition of Latino. Um, Very little of the race because it really has. It's weird to explain, but like okay, I'm just going to explain to you what the actual definitions of Hispanic and Latino are. So Hispanic are people who come from a majority Spanish-speaking country, especially ones that were colonized by Spain in the 1500s, 1600s, especially after Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean and discovered these lands for the Spanish crown. And then him and his followers and his successors conquered these lands slowly but surely over time. You have the Caribbean, then you followed by Mexico, and then the South America area, Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, etc., etc. And actually, Spain itself, by the way, is a Hispanic country. So one can be from Spain, they can immigrate to the United States, and that would be they would technically be Hispanic. Latino, on the other hand, from what I've understood and what I've learned, is someone who's from Latin America, and Latin America is defined as basically a lot of countries that are below the United States because they were colonized by again those Latin groups. Latin being Spanish or Portuguese or the French. You know, mainly countries that are derived or have a lot of influence from Latin, the Latin language, the Latin language. Again, those are again languages like Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian. Those are a lot of those are mainly languages. Those are Romance languages. So that's why also um, you have countries like Brazil, which are considered Latino, but you wouldn't have countries like Spain, which would be considered Latino, because Latin America is referring to again the parts of North and South America that were colonized by those by the kingdoms, by those countries that we're talking about here. Not by England or other parts of Northern Europe. We're talking about like Latin Europe here. Latin being um, the main successors to like the Latin language, Spanish, French, Portuguese, those places essentially. Especially Spanish and Portuguese. I'm going to be honest with you when it comes to French. French is a little bit up in the air. I don't really know why French is not as relevant when it comes to that subject, but Spanish and Portuguese are at the moment, and that's why Brazil can be considered Latino but not Hispanic. and why Spain can be considered Hispanic, but not Latino. And Monzar Z here has this chart up on the thing here from Wikipedia. I can tell from the font it's from Wikipedia, and he tries to make the argument, oh, it's up to you whether it's a race or whether it's ethnicity. But it's like when you even look at this chart here, it says it divides it up by race within Hispanic and Latino right here. White and mestizo and black and two more races or American Indian. So I mean, like, what I'm trying to say here is that him showing this graph can confuse people, especially Americans like myself who don't know any better, who may look at this graph and be kind of confused or perplexed by what they're looking at here. But like this is kind of like, in my opinion, a misunderstanding and misrepresentation because to me, Hispanic or Latino is basically ethnicity related. It's related to ethnicity. It's not related to quote unquote race, as race has been defined in the year 2023. So for him to start off the video saying like, "Oh, it's either race or ethnicity," it's like, no, 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 no. I disagree with that. Like Latino and Hispanic are mainly ethnicities. They're not. They're not mainly race. You can be Latino, and you can be you know my skin tone here too. You could be even lighter than this and could be Latino or Hispanic. You can be a darker skin tone than I am, and et cetera, et cetera. You can be from East Asia, then your family immigrates to Latin America, and then they become Hispanic or Latino as well because their family immigrated there, and then their children grew up in those countries, et cetera, et cetera. This is why it's very odd when you actually like read about like the actual definitions of what these things are. Because like, yeah, if you don't know any better and you're an American like myself and you just watch the news or something like that and you hear these terms being thrown around, and then um you see people on the news from Latin America and they tend to be like brown skin or have a very tan skin tone. Um, some would consider that to be mestizo. That, for example, is something that would confuse people, but it's really not that complicated. I would argue it's not. I would argue it's not really a race thing. It's definitely more of an ethnicity thing. So let's go on here.
Its presence as a group is prominent, surpassing African Americans as the second largest racial group in the country, standing at about 19 to 21% of the total population. Or if we were to count all his.
See, again, here's the thing. He claims again that um, Hispanic and Latino surpass Black Americans or African Americans. And this again goes back to what I would argue is a misunderstanding again of what Hispanic and Latino are. Because again, someone could be Black and they can also be Hispanic or Latino. They're not like someone could be white and they could be Hispanic and Latino, or they could be brown skin or they could be mixed raced, or they could be mainly someone who's of indigenous descent. Someone who's indigenous to that land before the Spanish arrived or before the Portuguese arrived, and they could be they could be Hispanic or Latino as well. Like this is to me when he says this, it's a misunderstanding and it's of this of who they are, of who Hispanic and Latinos are by American society and by the American government. Um, yeah, and it's just a misunderstanding, in my opinion, is what I'm trying to say here. So I think Mr. Z is misunderstanding here. I'll replay it again, but yeah.
Notably higher as Hispanics as a racial or ethnic identity, both of which being somewhat imperfect descriptors. Its presence as a group.
Okay, so he says again, somewhat imperfect descriptors, but doesn't explain what that even means or why those are imperfect descriptors. Why exactly is what is an imperfect descriptor about labeling Hispanic or Latino as an ethnicity when there's multiple examples and reasons for why that can be considered more of a ethnicity thing than a racial thing.
Group is prominent, surpassing African Americans as the second largest racial group in the country, standing.
So again, he says surpasses African Americans or Black Americans as the second largest racial group in the country, but it's weird for him to say that when I've read about like different terms or definitions of Hispanic and Latino, and when you find out that like a good portion, like Latinos and Hispanics can be black, they can be white, they can be mixed race, they can be, brown or mestizo, because again, a lot of the people that were from that area were there before conquistadors arrived and took it over, and a lot of them passed away because of diseases and stuff like that. Um, and a lot of the Spanish and the Portuguese also brought over slaves from Africa as well. And this again is what another argument I want to make is a misunderstanding of Latin American history, the history of Mexico, the history of Brazil, Argentina, other countries in Hispanic world or Latin America. This to me is a misunderstanding of or ignorance of those histories of those countries, because there was a lot of like similar there's some similarities here between the history of the United States and the history of these other countries. But in the United States educational system, I was brought up in it as well. This really isn't something that is discussed about a lot. There are some minor details, at least from my personal experience. Like the minor details are, or it's not a minor detail, but the details are essentially Columbus comes to the New World, comes to the Caribbean, Hispaniola, and then colonizes those places under for the Spanish crown, and then people like Hernando Cortez and his conquistadors arrive in Mexico and take over, and then you got people like Francisco Pizarro, they take over, et cetera, et cetera. But that's basically it. There's really not much after that. At least in my personal experience, there was a lot of the history I've had to learn about this part of the world. I've had to do it on my own, basically. Um, and when you discover more about this part of the world, you get to understand more of the diversity of it or the variety of it. Um, I think it's easy for just based on, again, I'm an American, and just seeing how we treat our own history versus the history of other countries. It's easy to get to think like we're like more unique when just compared to other countries for some reason, because we've had all these things happen in our country and we're very focused on our own history, and that's totally understandable. It is our own history as an American citizen. At the same time, though, we should also be aware of other people's histories when we're discussing things like this, because um, if we don't understand those other histories, we are putting ourselves into a position where we make a bunch of assumptions about these people, and it's easy to do because it's easy for us to just make assumptions. And this is a great example here. Where they just it's being assumed that Hispanic and Latino are just somehow a racial group that's like separate or distinct from like white Americans or black Americans. When the only thing that's separating them is that they come from Latin America. You know, um, again, I can bring up the example of Brazil, which is, by the way, a Latino country, but it's not a Hispanic country because Hispanic is Spanish speaking and Brazil is mainly Portuguese. There were a lot of African slaves that were shipped not just to the United States, but to places like Brazil. I've seen statistics that have argued that Brazil even got more African slaves than the United States did. And there were other countries that were mainly Spanish speaking ones that also got some of these extra African slaves. Um, so the idea that like, and I say this because this happened. These African slaves were not just brought to the United States; they were brought to these other countries as well in the Americas. But the way it's presented, in my personal experience, when it comes to the education system, is it's almost never brought up, or even, I would say it was never brought up for me. Like I can't even really even if it was brought up, it was like a side note essentially that there were Africans that were shipped to other parts of the world. It's like I have to really think about it if I'm going to be honest with you. It was something that was never really implanted in my head. Um, what was a heck of a lot more emphasized was the United States' own experience with African slaves and the slave trade essentially. And so, but because of that, though, we miss out on these other parts of history, including the slave trade of other countries around that time period. So, um, What I'm trying to say is like these other countries in Latin America have a lot of diversity for a variety of reasons, and some of those reasons are very similar to the United States, including the African slave trade, including Europeans coming over and immigrating themselves. And yeah, all right, let's keep going.
At about 19 to 21% of the total population, or if we were to count all Hispanics as a single ethnic group, they would be the largest ethnic population, surpassing the second largest group of German Americans, who only stand at about 13% of the total population, having fallen from around 22% in 1990. And
Okay, so I want to bring this up too because he brings up German Americans. So it's kind of interesting too because, again, if the, there have been examples where also Germans, for example, um, I think for many Americans, the example is Germans after World War II immigrating to Argentina and their descendants, being born in Argentina and living in Argentina. Of course, there were Germans who came to those countries before World War II and even World War One. Those Germans and their descendants would be are technically their descendants are Latinos. Those Germans, the descendants of those Germans, and maybe you can even argue those Germans themselves that immigrated after they gained citizenship to places like Argentina and elsewhere, you can argue that those are Latinos or they're Hispanics because they grew up in those places. They most likely um, spoke Spanish. If they did learn German or retain some of their German identity, then it's still, they were still Hispanic and Latino at the end of the day because they're from those places now. Their families immigrated from Germany to, again, Chile is a great example I could think of because even the military of Chile has a lot of influence from the German army. So, and advisors and stuff like that. If you watch these military parade videos of Chile, you can see they even use the old helmets that were used like 100 years, over 100 years ago by the German military. So Germans immigrated to a lot of different places, the United States included, but they also immigrated to Latin America, places in Latin America. Again, Argentina is a very popular example for us in America because of World War II, but like there were Germans going to other parts of the world. And so it's kind of interesting to hear this because, he's defining German Americans as like a separate thing, which is interesting. And I suppose like I get where he's coming from because they came from Germany, but they immigrated to the United States. At the same time, no, we also think about how there's multiple Germans who also immigrated to the Hispanic countries or Latino countries. And, I mean, technically speaking, those people are Hispanics as well. They're also Latino because that's how vague and broad of a definition we're talking about here. Those are also ethnicities that, can be considered part of Hispanic and Latino. They were descendants of Germans, but they went to those other places instead. And the difference here is because they went to those places, and then they could have immigrated to the United States, and they could be considered Latino Hispanic because they came from those countries, Hispanic countries, Latino countries. But their great 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 grandparents could have been Germans from Germany directly, and instead of going directly to the United States, they go to Argentina or Chile or somewhere else in Latin America, and then they could be considered part of Latino or Hispanic as well. It's a very weird thing to maybe think about for some people, but it makes sense though because again, like that's how broad and vague those definitions are. And so when we talk about these things like this, I just think it's important to bring those examples up because a lot of people in America, in my opinion, have a preconceived idea of who a Hispanic person are or who a Latino person is. Like I even heard it said in person, like, "Oh, they don't look Hispanic," or "Oh, they don't look Latino." Like, but that's not. God, excuse me. But like, it's a very diverse body of people. It's you can't just like assume all Hispanic or Latinos are mestizo or brown skin or very tan in or you can't just assume they're all of an indigenous descent or origin because that's not how these countries formed. That's not how these countries work even today.
If we were to further break this down along ancestral nationality, Mexican Americans alone nearly match German Americans and African Americans with an estimated 12% of the total American population.
Okay, so I want to bring this up too
Match German
because
Americans and African Americans with an estimated 12% of the total American population.
I mean I'm sure he'll go more into details about this as well because I don't remember every little detail. But like again, he's also putting in Mexican now, and Mexican is just one portion of Hispanics or Latinos. And yes, while there are a sizable amount of Mexican Americans or Americans of Mexican descent in the United States, Hispanics are not just Mexicans. Latinos are not just Mexicans. There's multiple countries: Ecuador, Peru, it's Chile, Argentina, um, even territories. Puerto Rico, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, um, and to be specific with Latino, Brazil. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of confusing when you present it like this, though, because it kind of confuses people. It's like you got the other ethnic groups: Germans, Black or African American, Irish, English. It's like it's like saying I can't think of an analogy right now, but it's like this would be like saying like all Europeans are the same somehow. Like this would be like because okay, you got German Americans you got German European immigrants or ancestors who immigrated to the United States. Let's say there was a term that all Europeans were categorized in somehow. That's like similar to like Hispanic or Latino somehow. Like I don't know, like let's just say like let's just assume like somehow like this there's a term caught on like a European term that meant someone who emigrated from this country, and like all of a sudden they just assumed they were all like Germans or something like that. But in actuality, they're not all Germans. They're all like English or Irish or Swiss or Sweden or or Swedish or Norwegian, or Scottish, or Serbian even. I don't know. Like something. The point I'm trying to make is like they're all being categorized. They're all being grouped together when um, it's not as simple as that. And same here with Mexican here, like because Mexican is just one group of Hispanics or Latinos, among other groups.
Politicians from both parties have also taken note of this, and there has been a noticeable shift in political rhetoric to sway Hispanic American favor to their respective sides, while at the very same time we're seeing an increased participation by Hispanic Americans in national level politics. With all these factors in mind, we must ask, could the future of America be Hispanic? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned.
Okay, so I just want to say like a quick thing here. It's just okay. It's just interesting because like I guess we should let him talk more. But like some of the things he's said so far, he's mixed like Latino, Hispanic, and Mexican interchangeably, as if they can all be the same thing. And like it's not this Mexican Americans are just one portion of Latinos or Hispanics. There are other portions of it. So when he asked the question, can the United States become a Hispanic country? What exactly is that implying to me so far? It's implying to me that he's thinking, it's just like Hispanic is like is he trying to suggest that Hispanic is just one certain thing only? I mean, we'll see though. We should let more of the video play.
Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who's donated to us on Patreon, Utreon, and right here on YouTube through channel memberships. Your donations really go a long way to keeping this channel going, and by donating to us across any of these platforms, you'll get access to some great perks, including physical merch, a custom-designed flag wallpaper, and access to an exclusive members-only Discord server where you can enter your scenarios for a chance to have them made into full videos. You can follow the pop-up on screen here and go to the comment section or description to visit any of these pages and support our channel, and of course you can do so by clicking the join button right below this video. If you can't donate anything, consider subscribing and sharing this video to help the channel out. Now, back to the video.
If doing IT still feels like 1995, you need a Terra, the world's first AI-powered
Hispanic Americans are the second fastest growing demographic in the US.
Okay. New Latino or Hispanic and Asian American destination. Latino or Hispanic and Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial and ethnic groups nationally, increasing by 22% and 35.6% respectively from 2010 to 2020. At the same time, there's a growing dispersion of both groups of new destinations, which tend to lie further afield than the familiar large metro areas. Okay, so okay, so so okay. This is kind of confusing wording here from whoever wrote this piece that he's screenshot here. Latino, Hispanic, and Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial and ethnic groups nationally. So again, I would argue that Latino or Hispanic are not really great indicators of a racial group as it's defined by the United States, or what the United States has defined as racial groups. Asian Americans is also kind of confusing too, because to me, it's like, are we talking about just East Asia? Are we also talking about South Asia? I know traditionally speaking in the United States, from my experience, Asian Americans have been like Japanese, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, maybe Vietnamese Americans, but like, Asia's a big place too. Like Latin America happens to be also a big place with a lot of different kinds of people and a lot of kind of variety of people and backgrounds. So is South Asia going to be defined differently in the future, maybe than East Asia? What about Latino or Hispanic? I mean, like, what's to say 10 to 15 years from now that like Latino or Hispanic will be, not as relevant anymore in the United States, or they'll be divided between like maybe Northern Hispanics and Southern Hispanics, or something like that, or is it going to be more divisions, more labeling going on here? Because like um, again, these are more vague terms than I think than I would argue some Americans understand them to be. Um, Latino, Hispanic come off as terms that just simplify things for Americans like myself. But when you actually like read up on these definitions and you actually learn about these countries and stuff like that, um, it it doesn't come off as very simple anymore. It just comes off as a lot more interesting to me. It comes as a lot more fascinating to me. It comes off like I want to learn more about these places and their backgrounds and the people who've lived there, who've settled there, and just things like that. Just the history of these places, because the history of these places, in my opinion and in my experience, have been overlooked a lot. They don't get a whole lot of attention. Um, Even in the case of Mexico, I mean, like, it's like I have to go out of my way to find out that Cinco de Mayo is not the same thing as Mexican Independence Day, for example, and that to learn on my own when Cinco de Mayo became a thing, why it's relevant, what the events were that made it happen, and funny enough, how Cinco de Mayo actually tied into may have tied into the American Civil War, also like just the French influence with that event, how the French tried to take control of Mexico, um, and how the Mexican War for Independence was a war fought between the rebels versus the Spanish crown back in Spain, and how it was a very long, drawn out, bloody conflict. And it's a conflict that interests me because the little I know about it fascinates me because of apparently it was a very bloody conflict and makes me want to learn more about it, just like some of these other conflicts that I would like to learn more about, including the Russian Civil War, including I would to recap, catch up more on the American Revolutionary War. I would to recap more on some other wars and events. But yeah, like from what I've understood about the Mexican War for Independence, it was very bloody because Spain wanted to control Mexico. Obviously, it's a big piece of land. I mean, look at where Mexico is located, having control to the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, and along with all these other colonies, Spain had a lot of wealth that was generated from all these different colonies, and of course, so Spain wants to try and keep control of all this stuff. Um, as we all know, that didn't work out in the end, just as it didn't work out for the British with the United States. So, um, and it's just so much more into detail here. I mean, like I'm talking about an 8-minute video from Mr. Z, and it's almost 30 minutes into my live stream here, talking about all these different things related to this video here. So it could go on for a while here.
Only to Asian Americans, who comprise a much smaller segment of the population and whose proportional growth is inflated because of this. The Hispanic population is expected to reach 29% of the total American population by 2050, and
See, okay, this is a graph here that's being used. That's like this is again how you know Hispanic is a very like this how Hispanic may be a very like Americanized term, a term that's very much used in the United States, Hispanic and Latino, because like um I'm not sure how much the term Hispanic or Latino are used in in the Spanish speaking countries or in the Portuguese speaking countries. There's a video that I like to recommend to you as well from this other channel called Bad Empanada. The video is called "Latino is not a useful category: How Americans Get It Wrong," and I did watch that before I watched this. I'm rewatching the video again, and having watched that, and it's not the first time I watched that video, but that was a recap, just like how it's a recap for me to rewatch this other video from Mr. Z again. But like, I'm seeing all these graphs and these statistics that Mr. Z is putting out there, and it's a reminder to me of how like, just how these things are classified within the United States and how the context is different and how the meanings are different in the United States. Because yes, I it does make me curious. It does make me want to go to or maybe not go to, but ask people in places like Mexico, in Chile, in Peru, in Argentina, in Guatemala, and in Colombia, for example. Can you look at these graphs here? Look at this white, Hispanic, Black, Asian graph that it's being used here. That's made. It's a graph that's in the U.S. Can you understand this graph? Like, what is about this graph that's confusing or surprising to you? Because when they see Hispanic and then they see white and black and then they see Asian, it's like to them that's like why Hispanic. There's probably white people that exist in their countries and black people that exist in their countries and mixed race and brown skin and mestizo and all that stuff. So um, yeah, it's just an interesting topic to me.
is expected to peak at 35 to 40.
And I'm not going to totally put it all on Mr. Z here or more Munzar Z. He also is from he's from the United States like I am. So he's just going off of what he knows from the United States. If I didn't look into it myself, I probably wouldn't know any better myself. I would probably be looking at it in a very similar way that he may be looking at right now. I know when I was younger, that's the way I saw it too. When I was a kid or a young teenager. Honestly, I should probably bring this up right now, but I went to high school with a lot of Hispanic people, and I went to college and met more Hispanic people, more Latino people, and it's really to me showed me the diversity or the variety of people that can be defined as Hispanic or Latino, and it just goes to show you like it's not as simple as what the U.S. news media has portrayed it to be for years and years and years. When you actually just get to know people, you get to talk to people that come from these different places. I've met and known Hispanic people who were Puerto Rican, who were Mexican, who were Colombian or Venezuelan, or from Argentina, or Chile, or Ecuador. Just like all these different places, even Spain. So it's like it really helped to expand my idea of who that can be, and the variety of people that has been a result of like the history and the time of it, and the time of the time span of things to make it a lot more complicated, and it's not so simple as just Hispanic and Latino, the way we normally think of it as it has been thought about in the United States.
40% in 2065. These numbers are enormous, especially when we consider that the current most widespread ethnic group in the United States, German Americans, only ever hit an estimated peak of around 20 to 30%, and only did so after a several decade-long period. Enough that in 1751, Ben Franklin had been complaining about the replacement of Anglo-Americans by German Americans in the state of Pennsylvania. Immigration has been the foremost driver of this population growth, with the U.S. experiencing an unprecedented rise in immigration from Latin America since the reform.
Okay, again, I like to point something out again because he brings up the German American example again. What exactly separates a German person who immigrates to the United States from a German person who decided to immigrate to Latin America? You know, I think that's a good question to ask ourselves here because he used the German American example. And again, that's because a German person immigrated directly to the United States or they went to a few countries but eventually ended up in the United States. There are multiple German people who decided to go to Latin America instead. What exactly makes them different from a German person who um, went directly to the USA and became a German American? As far as I know, as far as I'm concerned, it's because they went to Argentina or they went to another Latin American country. And by the definition of Latin American or by the definition of Hispanic, that German person who immigrated to a Latin country or Hispanic country, they can be considered Hispanic or Latino, and their descendants, if they have children and those children grow up in those countries, they too can also be considered a Latino or Hispanic. Um, it just goes to show you who can be a Latino and who can be Hispanic. It's just it's very I mean it's fascinating to me because like again in America I think it's safe to I think it's reasonable to assume that a lot of Americans when you ask them who a Latino is or a Hispanic person is, they tend to think of someone who is like very tan, not like super dark skin or like not black, not like a black American or African American, but someone who's like very olive skinned or very tan, or like a brown complexion or something like that. And look, yeah, that's totally part of it because for thousands of years you had people who were indigenous to those areas before Europeans came who settled and lived in those lands. And even though a lot of them were wiped out by by diseases that the Europeans came with. A lot of it was unintentional at first because of the diseases. It was but what am I trying to get at here? A lot of them wiped out by disease, but a significant amount of them survived, and a bunch of them also intermarried with Europeans, or they intermarried with African slaves. And I know it's a broad generalization right here, but it just goes to show you though that it's not as simple as what I described. The typical idea of what a Hispanic or Latino person is, to the average American, like myself. Like it's not as simple as someone who has like olive skin or a tanner skin complexion. Um, you can be from Germany and be super pale or whatever, and have moved to a Latin American country, and then you intermarry with someone who is like an indigenous woman or an indigenous man, or someone who's already from that area who has a darker skin tone than you, or vice versa. And you have some kids, or you can or whatever. You can have someone who's from the same kind of like background that you're from, white, or if you're black, you're black, or if you're indigenous, you're indigenous. It just goes to show you that, and you have kids, whatever. You have kids in Latin America, and they grow up and they speak Spanish, most likely. Again, they may know German too, but like they're probably not using German as much as they're using Spanish. But it's totally possible to also speak German and also speak Spanish because you can be bilingual or multilingual in Latin America. Like it could be multilingual in other parts of the world as well. Um, so yeah, no, it's just I just find that interesting that he's using a German American example because it makes it I makes me wonder like does he know that one can be of a German background and still be Latino or Hispanic? Because you totally can be.
Reformed Immigration Act of 1965 ended the proportional immigration criteria previously in place. Reforms in the early 90s only increased the opportunity for immigration to the United States and further saw a rise in the prevalence of illegal border crossings. Just prior to this, Ronald Reagan had hoped to resolve the crisis of illegal immigration by both beefing up border security and providing amnesty to all illegal immigrants within the country. However, border security measures were lackluster, and amnesty only encouraged greater unauthorized border crossings, as many across Mexico and the rest of Latin America now recognize a possibility for gaining legal residency in the U.S. without needing to follow legal procedures. This trend has largely continued into the present day, and because of the United States policy of birthright citizenship, the children of illegal immigrants automatically gain citizenship status, and their parents gain protection from deportation.
So only thing I got to say about that so far is it makes me curious, just like had my curiosity about Latin American history. Um, what he describes as lackluster immigration during the Reagan administration, and what he described as like lackluster security at the border. If those were the cases, like why was that the case? What were the reasons behind that? What was the motivations behind that? What was there some kind of motivations or factors behind why it was so lackluster? Be kind of curious to find out more about that. That's a part of that's something I don't know as much about. Aside from economic opportunities or aside from economic reasoning as to why that would be allowed, like companies wanting to hire illegal, undocumented migrants workers to, to work they want to hire them for lower wages. That's one possible reason I could think of off the top of my head. Um, there could be other reasons too, but um, again, that's just something just throw out there, speculation wise. Um, yeah, let's just move on because that's something I don't really know as much about. But um, it's kind of interesting though. I think the one thing I will say about it is it shows you this is not a new thing. There have been people who have been crossing the southern U.S. border for decades and decades, even before the 1980s. There was one example where there was like a mass deportation that happened in like the 1930s as well, if I recall. But yeah, no, I mean like people have been crossing the borders for many decades, many centuries even. I mean like Texas, as we know it, one of the main reasons Texas even exists is because Americans or European Americans, however you want to define them, came to Texas when Texas was still part of Mexico, and over time they to simplify it, they started their own war for independence, their own war against the Mexican government, and that's why that's why we have the Alamo and the Battle of the Alamo, and Texas became its own short-term country for a few years until they decided to join with the United States. And then these other countries in the Southwest here, like California, Arizona, New Mexico, those were all part of Mexico again at one point. Of course, those were also all part of the Spanish Empire, and they were all then part of the newly formed state of Mexican state, country Mexico. And then the United States, fought a war with Mexico to get those lands, and that's why we have those lands that we do have over there right now.
Naturally, this has encouraged a practice of crossing the border to give birth in the U.S. for the sake of gaining these benefits.
Okay, so actually, that was something that I'm glad he brought up because I listened to this video earlier, and I know what he's talking about right there. So one thing I find interesting about what he's talking about there with the birthright citizenship that like parents would like come and even though they're undocumented, they would have kids in the United States, and those kids would have citizenship because of birthright citizenship. Um, and one of the reasons they did that was because to safeguard themselves or to prevent themselves from being deported. I mean, we already know that hasn't always worked out too well though, because that's one of the reasons why we have DACA, because their parents did end up getting deported, and those kids are just left there to kind of in some cases fend for themselves essentially. Yeah. So that didn't always work out. It's a crazy situation. It's a very controversial one for sure. Um, because yeah, if you deport their parents, then they're alone essentially. But I'm just kind of surprised that I get why parents would do that, but like I still think you're taking a huge risk right there because they may still deport you anyway. Like even if they don't deport your child, there's no guarantee you're not going to get deported because you're still not a citizen. So
within the U.S. for the sake of gaining these
and of course that's what happened too. I mean, that wasn't always a guarantee either. That has happened. Yes.
benefits. Aside from immigration trends, Black American births within the U.S. are quickly on the rise, all the while the number of both white and Black American births have declined. What this indicates is that all the while the number of both white and Black American births in the U.S. for the sake of gaining these benefits. Aside from immigration trends, Hispanic American births within the U.S. are quickly on the rise, all the while the number of both white and Black American births have declined. What this
Okay, so even this here points out this graph here points out that there's a white and then there's a non-Hispanic white. There's a white total, and then there's Hispanic, and then there's non-Hispanic white, and it's kind of confusing how like this is why Hispanic's a very confusing thing to begin with because it even admits that there's like a white total and then there's a non-Hispanic white. So it's admitting that um, it's a kind of a weird way to it's a weird see that's why it's just kind of confusing honestly because it's like again Hispanic just means people who are from Spanish speaking countries like I know I already mentioned it earlier but like it's just weird that when you see graphs like this and it's kind of confusing because like you could be all those things you could be and Hispanic you can be white and Hispanic you can be black and Hispanic you could be Asian and also Hispanic you could be indigenous and be Hispanic um but yes I suppose let's just ignore that and let's just I guess think of the what was supposed to be the traditional concept I guess of Hispanic in the United States which is most likely someone who has a tanner skin complexion, olive skin or tanner. Um, someone who's probably has some indigenous ancestry, Native American ancestry, whatever you want to call it. I know there's people who've argued that I've watched people who've argued Native American is really much of a term used in Latin America. So, but again, I'm also an American, so I'll use the term Native American or indigenous and they're mixed with that and European or mixed with that and American, excuse me, African or black. Yeah, so it's just interesting to see this, and it's just kind of confusing because it's like it also makes me wonder like should we really be using Hispanic to be defining something like this? I guess for the time being, it's just convenient to do it because that's the way it's been done for years and years and years. Um, but it's still like it's still odd though because you have to be willing to ignore the details of of who someone of who someone who's Hispanic or someone who's Latino and what that could mean and what they could look like because they don't look the same. That's what I'm trying to say.
This indicates is that while other domestic populations slow in their growth or even begin to shrink, the Hispanic American population will grow even higher, leaving it to have an even greater share of the national population. The Hispanic population in America is both concentrated and building a presence across the country. Already, the states of Texas, California, and New Mexico have plurality Hispanic populations, that is, Hispanics outnumber whites, blacks, and other racial groups in these states, but don't yet have a majority. Within 30 years.
Okay, so this is what I mean then, again, with the racial group thing. I would argue, see, he's Mr. Z is making the argument from his wording, from my point of view, just based on the wording he's using right there. He uses the wording of racial more than he uses the word of ethnicities. And to me, I do not agree with that. Like, to me, Hispanic is more of an ethnicity thing than it is a racial thing. Way more ethnicity than racial. So when he keeps using racial more than ethnicity, that to me is not the most accurate term to use because um, again, like Hispanic can be different kinds of race groups or different kinds of racial identities based on based on the definition of Hispanic and just defining those kind of things. Um, because I'm just gonna say it again. One can be white and be Hispanic. One can be indigenous and be Hispanic. One could be black and be Hispanic. One could be from Japan or their parents are from Japan and they moved to a Latin American country and they grew up there and their parents are from Japan, but they speak Spanish in a Latin American country. They can technically be considered Hispanic as well. So, um, but seeing Mr. Z here, Monsieur Z, use the term racial more often than I'm seeing hearing him use ethnic, it kind of like and I see why I know why I think I know why he's doing that because in America it has that more of that people seem to affiliate that more with a racial thing than with ethnicity thing just because of the news media and other reasons as well, but definitely the news media in my opinion has a big huge factor to play for that. But we just look up the definition of Hispanic. It's it's uh it's not it's hard for me to believe or to think of it as a racial thing because again, I just it's a very it's just that's just not how that's not how the Hispanic countries work. That's not how Latin America works. Latin America is a very diverse place as well. I said that earlier, but like this again goes back to my frustration with the United States and with my fellow Americans. I have noticed with my fellow Americans that we tend to think of ourselves very highly, and I say that of all of us of different political beliefs as well, or different political backgrounds, including Americans who like to like to proclaim or like to preach is a good word I'm trying to use there. Preach about our diversity and preach about our multiculturalism and preach about our different heritages in the United States, and that includes Latino and Hispanic heritages. However, I also noticed that these same people who preach this kind of stuff don't really pay attention to examples of this outside of the United States. They're just focused and more. They're focused, from my own personal experience, on stuff within the United States. And and while that could be cool to some to some degree, that could be cool. However, if you just focus only on the United States in that regard, you're missing out on the diversity, you can say, of a place like Mexico. You're missing out on the diversity of a place like Argentina or Chile or the Central American countries or places like Venezuela and Colombia or Brazil. You're missing out on the diversity of places in Asia or South Asia, East Asia. It's you're missing out on the diversity of places in Europe, for example. There's different ethnic groups in Europe. There's different parts of Europe, different peoples in Europe. It's not all the same. Same thing with same thing with the Latin America or Europe or Africa or other parts of the world. Um, the point I'm trying to make here is that we tend we as an Americans sometimes we tend to highly value ourselves. We value ourselves a lot, and that can be good sometimes. But too much of that and and too much inward focus on that kind of stuff. It leads to, in my opinion, it leads to ignoring um, the outside world. And it leads to ignoring other countries and how they see things as well. And that's why I think we have this situation here with Hispanic and Latino because we like those who are more liberal or progressive. You can especially those kinds of people, and and they're Americans, but they have that kind of political background. Will very much be will like to very much preach about that kind of diversity, but they make the same mistake too as the conservative Americans of just lumping together all these different groups into Latino or Hispanic, and that's not that's not a very nuanced way of looking at it. It's not a very That's not a very diverse way to say of looking at that situation because you're talking about millions upon millions upon millions of people of millions of different backgrounds, millions of different stories, millions of different ways of how things have become the way they are. You know, and the same is true in the United States of America. The same has happened. A very similar story has happened in the United States of America. Again, we just say we're in the United States. We just say we're a nation of immigrants, and that's very true. A lot of immigrants come from a lot of different parts of the world. The same is also true though in Latin American countries. There have been multiple generations of multiple different immigrants coming from multiple different parts of the world to those different countries as well, to varying degrees. There have been examples of different ethnic or racial groups who actually have come to more to in higher numbers, who have gone to certain places in higher numbers than they have to the United States, whether by choice or by force. So um, we like exceptional is another term I was trying to think of while doing this live stream, but exceptionalism is not just something that exceptionalism is something that's very big in the United States for some reason. I don't know the details of it, but even in like more left-leaning or progressive circles or liberal circles, exceptionalism is not something that's like not done there too. Without a doubt, this whole thing about us being a melting pot and a nation of immigrants, it leads to this exceptionalism that the United States is somehow unique compared to other countries when it comes to things like diversity and multiculturalism. When that's not true, essentially. And all this talking, but essentially that's why I think there's a misunderstanding now about what a Hispanic person is or what a Latino person is because um, we tend to get so caught up in our ideas of you know that multiculturalism, that diversity, and don't really look too much into the details sometimes. And by the way, I totally encourage people to look into the details sometimes. I don't always do it, but when I do it, it's awesome. I have fun with it. Again, I like learning it. I like learning the history of these different places outside of the United States as well. I've learned history about places like Argentina and Mexico and Chile and Puerto Rico and Cuba and other places. It's fun to me. It's exciting to me. It's fascinating. I get to learn. I get to learn these different countries and their histories, and I notice that there's some similarities sometimes between those countries and the United States, and it's actually pretty cool. So, and there's sometimes I notice there's differences, but I mean, like, yeah, it's fun, and I realize that these countries are not so different in as maybe perhaps I thought in the past. I get to learn, is what I'm trying to say, and it's fun to learn.
Years, Hispanic majorities will almost certainly emerge across these states, and further within Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, and Florida, major pluralities or even potential majorities emerging in New York and New Jersey, and likely pluralities in Oklahoma, Georgia, Illinois, Washington, Oregon, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, North Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. The Southwest and Florida are almost certain to become the strongholds of Hispanic American culture and political influence, influencing both conservative and liberal culture and politics by acting as a major support base, which both parties will hope to appeal to and actively orient their policies to further include Hispanic American interests.
Um, yeah, no, I mean, that's some good guesses right there. Definitely, especially about the Southwest and Florida in terms of like Hispanic, more focused centers of the United States right now. Um, I'm gonna let him play a little bit more, but I want to hear where he goes with this before I make any more comments.
At this stage, Hispanic Americans are likely to continue supporting the Democratic Party, given the party's strong favoritism toward immigrant groups as opposed to the Republican Party's firmer position on nativism and stemming immigration. Given historic political trends among immigrants, the support for the more liberal faction will likely continue until the Hispanic American population feels it has gained all it can from Democratic politics and thoroughly shifted national policy, moving in a more pro Hispanic direction.
So I get where he's coming from there, and I think that's a reasonable thing to predict there, just based on what he mentioned there, because that has happened with other previous ethnic groups, from immigrant groups or racial groups in the United States. And he goes on to and he'll specify details here. I do remember this part, so I'll just part play.
Was the the conservative establishment of the Democratic Party during the early to mid 1800s and helped usher in an era of Republican dominance until this was seen among German, Scandinavian, and Irish Americans who opposed the conservative establishment of the Democratic Party during the early to mid 1800s and helped usher in an era of Republican dominance until disagreements later emerged between them and Anglo Americans over labor issues, the Great Migration, and matters of assimilation. Likewise, the same was seen with third waivers, that is, the Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and more newly arriving Irish Americans who threw their support behind FDR for the support he provided to the lower class laborers, immigrants, and urban areas. These third waivers being among the most active participants in the later civil rights movement, which they treated as not merely a movement of equality for African Americans, but a means to cripple the conservative social establishment of the country, which they saw as prejudiced toward not just African Americans, but themselves as well. And in the aftermath of the civil rights era, these same populations would also assume more conservative positions now that the social mindset of the nation was more favorable to them. In this
I want to learn more about these different examples he's talking about here, but based on what he said and based on things I read and videos I've seen and like documents and other things like that, and just like other political videos, like timeline videos with elections and stuff like that, all that sounds pretty similar to what's happened so far in these different examples here. Um, excuse me. But yeah, all that seems pretty similar to what has happened in those examples. Yeah, it's a and I've thought about that too. And like he mentioned earlier, how like a lot of Hispanics currently vote for the Democrat Party, and I do think that will continue to be the case. However, I will say that I will also argue that I believe that's going to slowly change over time. Though I think it's already started in a way. I think that some people are not fully understanding or fully realizing perhaps. I have the hypothesis, or I'm under the impression along with that again that hypothesis that some of that is already changing, that those who are Hispanic or Latino, especially those who have been living in the United States for a long time or their descendants have, may start to lean more towards a conservative lining. Speaking of Hispanic, by the way, I like to bring out another example that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. Um, those who were Spanish speaking that were in places like Colorado and the southern and the southwest United States before the United States ever took over. I think this goes to show you that his Hispanic influence is has always been very relevant, or not, I should say very relevant, but there has been some relevancy to some degree, even if it's a little relevant. I believe it's been there to some degree, one way or the other. Again, because of how influential the Spanish Empire was. Um, we tend to think of like the Old West sometimes as like a separate thing, especially because of the Hollywood movies. But like, there was definitely a lot of like mixing and influencing of each other with those in those times and stuff like that. I think it would make a great documentary. Maybe I will consider doing a documentary on it one day. But even even things like Tex-Mex, for example, could be an example of that. Um, I honestly wish I knew more about it, because like the Old West has been kind of like satirized, or not satirized. I'm sorry, saturated or sanitized by like Hollywood films sometimes, or TV shows. It'd be kind of interesting to kind of like do more in-depth presentations on America's Old West and explore perhaps stories or details of it that aren't really they're kind of overlooked in mainstream history circles and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, he's gonna say like essentially like as things as time goes on, more and more Hispanics may lean in a more conservative direction or may vote Republican or stuff like that. I think just based on what's happened so far over the past few decades, I don't know how many Hispanic Americans would turn that in that direction, but I think more and more will over time. I think it's already happening too. I think it started I think for some reason in 2016, it started becoming more and more relevant. Probably, maybe, possibly because some Hispanic Americans were also dissatisfied with the Democratic Party, what the Democratic Party was putting out there, and I think that is slowly continuing to go. Of course, there's a bunch of different factors that may change that as well, including the political candidates, including the different positions and stuff like that, and of course, different Hispanic ethnic groups. Because again, we have to reconsider here that Mexican has been the main one that's been brought up mainly, but you got a bunch of other different ethnic groups. How some Puerto Rican Hispanics may vote is going to be maybe different from how his Mexicans one will, or how someone from Argentina will vote. It's going to be different from some maybe different from someone from Nicaragua. But let's continue on here. Venezuelan, for example, a lot of Venezuelan immigrants coming here recently, Cuban Hispanics, etc.
Same vein, Hispanic Americans will almost certainly play a significant role as activists and power brokers in Republican and Democratic elections, with their support remaining firmly for that party which favors them the most, for the time that being the Democratic Party. However, once the course we've discussed has been run, once national views become pro-Hispanic, and of course once the Hispanic population settles in and accumulates a greater degree of both monetary and social capital.
Okay, so I have to stop the video there. I wish he'd kind of go more into detail about what he means by that, like the Hispanic position, Hispanic view. Let me rewind that again, because again that's kind of confusing to me.
Party. However, once the course we've discussed has been run, once national views become more pro-Hispanic, and of course,
Okay, so once national views become more pro-Hispanic, see, this is again kind of the issue here that I see when we use the term like Hispanic, because what does it even mean? What does pro-Hispanic mean exactly there? Like more friendlier to immigration maybe, but like that doesn't really, that's confusing to me though, but because like again that just shows me that the term Hispanic is a very American term. Like some people see, it's like when again I keep saying it, but like when you learn about what Hispanic means, which is just people who are Spanish speaking or who come from Spanish speaking countries, then you hear things like this where it says a pro Hispanic like position, political position. It's like, what does that even mean? Like someone who's Hispanic can support a libertarian or an authoritarian. They can support a conservative person. They can support a liberal person, a socialist or a capitalist thing. It's just it's Hispanic's just someone who's from an Hispanic country, a Spanish speaking country. It's like, what I'm thinking of as I'm thinking of this stuff off the top of my head with the live stream. It makes me think of the Spanish Civil War that happened in the 1930s. That would be like saying the left leaning factions, they have their positions, and that's like the Hispanic position. So what would General Franco? What would his would he does are his positions not Hispanic positions? General Franco, after all, was Hispanic. I'm pretty sure he was. Goes to Google to check on that. General Franco. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he was born in Spain. Yeah, Ferrol, Spain. I mean, the dude was Francisco Franco was Hispanic. Um, Spain is Hispanic. The factions that were fighting in the Spanish Civil War were mainly Hispanic factions, conservative leaning Hispanics and uh, left leaning Hispanics. But Hispanics nonetheless, Hispanics fighting Hispanics. So it's like, it's such a weird thing for me to hear someone like Monsieur Z or Mr. Z go the Hispanic position. Like, can you just explain what that means? Can you just say what that position is? Like, and can you? I mean, whatever. I mean, I don't think you should even be using the term Hispanic position to describe that, because that just feels like a convoluted or like a very contradictory kind of thing. You can just say the position of, oh, some of the people in this community support this, or some of the community support that, and I think he kind of already did say that, but then to kind of just like generalize it again by saying the Hispanic position, it's such a vague term. I'm just not a fan of it.
support remaining firmly for that party which favors them the most, for the time that being the Democratic Party. However, once the course we've discussed has been run, once
I mean, how do you know that like the Democratic Party favors, like I don't know, it's just like See, this is what I mean. This is the thing, but like trying to like classify all these different ethnic or racial groups into like something like this. It feels weird because like you're talking about millions of different individuals here, like myself. I'm an individual, like, and I'm just nitpicking this right now. I don't know. It's just I get this is a short video that he's making here. It's less than 10 minutes long, and this live stream's already over an hour long. But like, I don't know, dude. I just don't know if we should be making videos like that are this short if we're talking about topics that are like this. And if it is going to be short like this, then perhaps you need to go. You may need to just go into more detail on things like, if you're going to use a term like that, because I don't know. It doesn't seem such a. I mean, maybe to him it seems like a very simple thing, and maybe it seems like a very like, straightforward, obvious thing. But to me, it's not. Like, no, I want you to go into more detail about what you mean by that, because like there's Hispanics who could totally agree with what you're saying, and there's Hispanics who could totally disagree with what you're saying.
National views become more pro-Hispanic, and of course, once the Hispanic population settles in and accumulates a greater
Again, so yeah, like pro-Hispanic. I mean, it's just like, can you define what exactly that means?
degree of both monetary and social capital, its politics will evolve to reflect new needs.
What exactly reflect new needs? I don't know. See, it's just like this is weird to me. It's just like I don't know. It's like he's trying to even if you want to use like Irish Americans as the example he used earlier, or German Americans. There were German Americans who were left leaning. There were German Americans who were right leaning. There were Irish Americans who were left leaning. There were Irish Americans who were right leaning. I get off the top of my head, I could think of a bunch of German Americans in the late 1800s who moved from Germany to Chicago, and a bunch of them were left leaning. They were anarchists, and they were, workers activists and stuff like that, and labor activists, and they were like supporting the labor movement and whatnot, and stuff like that. And I'm sure there were Germans who were conservative. Does that, it's like I'm sure there were nativists back then who were like, who were like against the immigrants, who were against the German immigrants, and they used that immigrant hysteria, and especially for the Germans who were anarchists, and he's probably has had rhetoric or said something similar to this, where like the German position or the pro-German position or something like that, or whatever. I mean, it's just like it's just vague terms, just yeah.
Almost certainly, the Hispanic political divide in the United States will be highly reminiscent of what it has been across other large Latin American countries, a struggle between a conservative, Catholic, potentially authoritarian, or at least hierarchical faction, and a socially liberal, secular, egalitarian, or even socialist faction.
Okay, so he Latin American countries, and then he simplified, and then he says this politically speaking, what it's like here. Again, some examples of what he's talking about would be nice here. So I'm definitely more familiar with like the conservative examples, but there are left-leaning examples as well. And like Chile, for example, had that more of that like right-leaning, authoritarian, like description he's talking about. And now more recently, it's turned more left-leaning in Chile, and some other countries too. But in other countries, it's now turning more right-leaning as well. But yeah, okay. Let's go along with it for now.
How this would affect national politics is a bit difficult to say, but there are some assumptions we can make. Foremost, that the conservative ideology of the conservative Hispanics will be diametrically opposed to the current dominant conservative ideology in America, which is rooted in small government and Protestant principles.
See, when I listen to this in the car, I'm kind of getting the same reaction when I'm watching it here. I don't know how much I can agree with that. I'm kind of skeptical on that, to be quite honest. I would argue there are a lot of different positions that Protestant Americans hold and that Catholic Americans hold, including Hispanic American Catholics. I don't see why they can't find a lot of common ground on a lot of these different issues. I don't agree on there being such a stark divide. I mean, like, there are multiple Catholics who would agree with multiple Protestants on things like abortion, for example, or contraception or things like that. Um, the idea that they wouldn't work together because one is just intrinsically a small government mindset and the other one is big government mindset is also something I don't agree with, because the Protestant Americans, in my opinion, are sometimes argue for the use of big government in order to get their way. There's some currently in the government who are Republican leaning, who are conservative leaning, and some of them are also Protestants, and they're calling for federal-wide bans on abortion. That is not a small government act, in my opinion. When you get the federal government involved, that is a form of big government right there, using its power to enforce a nationwide abortion ban. That's not small government. And I just don't. I'm skeptical of that whole small government argument to begin with, because to me, any of these groups are willing to use big government if it means it supports their positions and their opinions and their solutions. So for him to classify it as like, oh, the Catholics are the only ones to support a big government solution while the Protestants support small government solution is something I have a hard time believing, because Protestants are willing to use and have shown that they're willing to support government um, to enforce the things that they want to do. And to me, that's a form of big government, because you're enforcing your way on people's lives, and it's not just because just because you support it doesn't mean it's not big government. You're still using the government to enforce this thing. So yeah.
Some Hispanic groups, particularly Venezuelans and Cubans who have fled authoritarian left-wing regimes, have come to adopt the small government view, but by and large, conservative Hispanic Americans.
Can you provide an example of that, please? I'm just saying, like, can you provide an example of what some Venezuelans or Cubans have, what that means? Can you provide an example? Like, yeah, it would just be nice to be an example, because like I'm supposed to just go off of like like what and the other thing too is like this is kind of like interpretation. It's like there's like what big government, small government can mean to me can be something different to Mr. Z here. So some examples would be good as well, in my opinion, of like what would you define these things as? Because what you may think is small and big government, I may not think that. Yeah.
Trend in favor of strong governments, something which may align them more with the populations of the big government northeastern and midwestern conservatives who have remained sidelined since the rise of neoconservatism. What this could result in is a fractured conservative America torn between.
I mean, I suppose so. I mean, like, but I mean, like, even the neocons use government to get their way sometimes. Yes, they may be hands off on certain things, or they may leave it to the states in certain cases. But there's also neocons who have argued for the use of government, including at the federal level, to enforce things that they want to have enforced.
In small government and big government politics, in which is ultimately unable to unite and challenge its left-wing opposition. Given the rise of figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the emergence of progressivism, it seems very likely the Democratic Party's gradual embracing of the Hispanic left's ideology will be far more seamless. However, there's also the possibility that the conservative factions, despite their disagreements, find increasingly progressive policy to be so egregious that they coalesce into an opposition faction, though it will no doubt be rocked by much the same divide seen within the Republican Party today. The United States probably won't end up as another Mexico or Brazil, but aspects of those countries.
Okay, so a couple things there. I think that's possible, but like you said, that's already happening now in the United States currently, and I think that's just a result of like how the United States operates as a country, and the same could be true. And the same could be true of the left leaning example he brought up. He argued that it's very seamless because of people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But who's to argue that could change though in a matter of years as well from right now? And that's arguing that it's like flexible right now. There's also divides within the left-leaning factions of the U.S. government. There's divides and there's some non there's some divides between those groups as well. And I think it's possible. It could go either way. But I mean, I know he's just guessing here, but like what I'm trying to argue is that I agree with the general ideas overall because the United States is set up like that currently, and it's just designed to. It's just designed where people can be elected on the local level and then go to the state or the federal level, and they come from all these different backgrounds and they bring all these different ideas from their constituents and from themselves to the state or the federal level, and even on a local level, like in a city like Chicago or New York City, where there's so many different people here, and even on a local level like that, or even a smaller city, you get different people living in a smaller city, and that can happen there too. Um, the second thing I want to talk about is he mentioned there too with the Brazil and Mexico thing. I'll play it again, but like this is again goes back to the confusion I notice with people who just interchangeably use Latino and Hispanic here.
faction, though will no doubt be rocked by much the same divide seen within the Republican Party today. The United States probably won't end up as another Mexico or Brazil, but as
Okay, so right off the bat, so I just want to say Brazil is not a Hispanic country. Brazil is a Latino country. Mexico can be both Latino and Hispanic. Let me just Google for you the definition of Latino country. Definition. So, Latin America. Latin America is a cultural concept denoting the region consisting of all the countries of the Americas south of the United States where Romance languages derived from Latin, are predominant. So, yeah, Portuguese, Spanish, those are examples there. Those are Romance languages, and those are languages that are predominant in Brazil and in Mexico. Brazil having Portuguese, Mexico having Spanish. Let's look up Hispanic. Hispanic country definition. The term Hispanic refers to people, cultures, or countries related to Spain, the Spanish language, or the Hispanidad broadly. So, again, mainly related to people, cultures, or countries related to Spain, Spanish language, or Hispanidad. Spanish language, so that would be Mexico, but less to a lesser extent, Brazil, and yeah, of course, there's gonna be, Spanish speakers in Brazil. I mean, but it's not the dominant language in Brazil. Portuguese is. So again, the point I'm trying to make here is that he just brings up Brazil and Mexico as if they should be the same thing, or they should be both put in the same category here. Because his title for this video again is "Will the United States become a Hispanic country?" So, and he just throws in Brazil there. So that to me tells me he doesn't fully understand what the term or the definition is Hispanic is. Because if he fully understood what the term Hispanic meant, then why is he using Brazil as his example there? He has a bunch of other countries to pick from. I'm just saying, like, a bunch of other countries to pick from when it comes to Hispanic, and he doesn't use them and stuff like that. I don't know. It's a weird thing too because again, like, I get why people might be confused by it because again, the Latino and Hispanic are used, or Latin and Hispanic are used so interchangeably that and there's multiple similarities, but there's also those differences that I explained. So, um, as will the United States become a Hispanic country by 2060? I mean, I suppose it's possible, but like, it wouldn't become Hispanic in the traditional sense that um, the other countries became Hispanic. Um, the other reason why the other countries are Hispanic is because Spain colonized those countries, took over the areas, and put, made it so that Spanish became the dominant language, and Spain became the dominant force in those places for many years. But and even after and even after all these countries gained various independences and became separate countries, they were still part of they were still part of the Hispanic world because even though they're independent, Spain still was a part of all that. It's kind of like how the British has the Commonwealth nations, that include the different countries that the British colonized, and a bunch of different countries are part of that as well. Um, so I'm gonna play the rest of the video here, but yeah, I mean it's hard for me to understand. I suppose if the United States became a Hispanic country, again it would be because of immigration. If you want to argue that is a thing, but it wouldn't be Hispanic in the sense that it wasn't conquered by the sword, like the conquistador, like a new wave of neo conquistadors come by and take it over, like Spain comes on, invades the United States or whatever. No, super highly unlikely.
Aspects of those countries will definitely begin to become apparent within American culture, politics, and life on a very noticeable scale over the next few decades. What should be most
I think it's already noticeable now. I mean, like we have Halloween coming up right now soon in my area, the Chicago area, and even when you go to a place like Dollar Tree and you see the Halloween decorations, you're already seeing Dia de los Muertos decorations as well, alongside traditional Halloween decorations. Now, granted, I don't know a ton about Dia de los Muertos outside of Mexico. I wish I did know more about it because it's actually a pretty interesting holiday to me. And Halloween itself, as we know it in America, is a very Americanized version of All Hallows Eve and All Saints Day and everything like that. And American Halloween has a lot of roots from like Ireland, for example. Um, and Dia de los Muertos, funny enough, has a lot of roots from Spain and from the indigenous cultures of Mexico. I would like to actually make a documentary about the history of both of those holidays. I don't know of, I don't know. I'm sure there's other alternatives of like Dia de los Muertos. I mean, I'm not sure of it, but there might be like in other Latin American countries similar holidays like that. Perhaps I don't know. I haven't had a chance to really look up on it. I just know that in Mexico there is Dia de. Um, it wouldn't surprise me, just given given the connection that these countries share and the different peoples sharing the different stuff. But um, I guess you could say from an American perspective, Dia de los Muertos is very much associated with Mexico. Um, and so what I'm trying to say here is I don't want to say Hispanic influence. I mean I want to say what I'm seeing there. It's more example of Mexican influence or Mexican American influence. I'm sure the same is happening down south where I've read things where I wish I would cite it, but I've read stuff where Halloween has become has made some influences there too in Mexico. That's something I should look more into for my history of Halloween documentary. I would to try and look more into that as well. But um, there are some examples where the Hispanic community in various forms has made some influences in the United States and vice versa. As for the United States becoming a Hispanic country, um, we'll play the rest of the video. I just want to do something at the end of it.
worried about are the spread of those same troubles which plague these countries, namely organized and general crime and widespread political corruption. This change in America.
Those things already exist in the United States. They may be worse, possibly less worse. I guess it. I mean, it's hard to to figure that out because like I think it probably depends on how we handle it here versus how it's handled other places. it's also a topic that I don't really know a whole lot about. And again, this is the problem with an 8 minute and 47 second long video is, you're talking about these broad general topics, and the downside is, you can't go into much detail about it in such a short amount of time. And I feel like I feel like I'm not really qualified to talk too much about it myself because I don't know a whole lot off the top of my head. I just know as an American that the reputation, especially in like Central America, is a lot worse when it comes to organized crime than it is here in the United States. Despite our problems we have here in the United States, the reputation and statistics make it look like Central America. And when I say Central America, I mean like below, even not even Mexico included. Uh, those Central American countries have a bad reputation. Mexico also has a somewhat bad reputation, but I feel like it's kind of like, here in the United States. If you know people in those countries, they know the spots, they know where to go, and you trust them and they trust you, you will probably be okay. Again, like if you know what you're doing and you know where you're going, and you have and you know people down in those places, and they're very friendly, and they're reliable, they're trustworthy. I think that makes you a lot better off, you know, if you know people down there who can show you around and stuff like that. They're not very. I don't like to imagine those kind of people would turn their backs on you. You know.
America's demographics is already in motion and only accelerates every day the American border remains open. Intensifying border security and completing the border wall will stop or significantly slow this inflow, and deportations of illegal immigrants will put a dent in the Hispanic population. But even with that, and even if we assume the proposed Republican policy of ending birthright citizenship is put into effect, the Hispanic American population that remains will likely still be sufficient enough to cause this change in the country by 2065. What do you think? Is the future of America Hispanic? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Mr. Z, out.
Okay, so I have the Wikipedia article up for Hispanic, and Mr. Z also used Wikipedia to bring up some statistics as well. So I don't feel too bad about it either. Um, you know, his Wikipedia does get a bad rep, but it's not as bad as people like to think it is. But I'll just read the definition here. The term Hispanic, or in Spanish, Hispano, refers to people, cultures, or countries related to Spain, the Spanish language, or Hispanidad broadly. The term commonly applies to Spaniards in Spanish speaking populations and countries in Hispanic America and Hispanic Africa, which were formerly part of the Spanish Empire. Due to colonization, mainly between the 16th and 20th centuries, the cultures of the Hispanophone, like the Francophone, just the Spanish version of Francophone, outside Spain had been influenced as well by the local pre-Hispanic cultures or other foreign influences. There was also Spanish influence in the former Spanish East Indies, including the Philippines, Marianas, and other nations. I think that's an important thing to bring up too, because I was thinking about that when I was listening to this video earlier. I was thinking to myself, what I was thinking about like what the definitions of Hispanic are and what the definition of Latino are. I thought to myself, wait a minute, like Spain had an empire, and one of the places they colonized was the Philippines. Why are the Philippines not considered Hispanic? They colonized the Philippines. Why is the Philippines not considered Hispanic? There are people there who have Spanish names, like as part of their name. They have like a Spanish surname, or they have, like it's just part of their. It might be part of that, or it might be some Spanish influence here and there. And yet, the Philippines is not considered part. The Philippines is not considered Hispanic. Why is that? So this Wikipedia article here says however, Spanish is not a predominant language in these regions, and as a result, their inhabitants are not usually considered Hispanic. So, I mean, that's a whole video right there in itself, right there. What constitutes Hispanic, and I already made an argument as to what can be considered Hispanic. But like, why is the Philippines not considered Hispanic? After all, the Spanish colonized the Philippines. It's because there wasn't enough time for the Spanish to really, you know, set up an establishing foundation for Spain to influence the Philippines to get people more Spanish speakers in the Philippines? Maybe not. Um, but if we go off the definition of a country that is predominantly Spanish speaking, um, I don't know if the United States is going to become a Hispanic country. If that's the definition we're using for a Hispanic country, a country that is majority Spanish speaking, um, I would argue that I'm not sure if the United States will become a Hispanic country because one major reason again is funny enough immigration. You also he was mentioning the southern border here, but it's not just Spanish speaking Latinos. You also have people from all around the world that immigrate to the United States, including Asian Americans that you mentioned here. Asian Americans constitute East Asians and South Asians, in my opinion, based on what I've seen. You know, India, for example, has a bunch of different languages, a bunch of different kinds of people. East Asia has a bunch of different languages, a bunch of different people. Um, all these people coming together, they come to the United States. Um, so I don't know. Gosh, I'm getting tired. I don't know if the United States will become a Hispanic country because there's a lot of different languages already in the United States. English is the predominant language, and it looks like English, just based off what I'm seeing in my own personal experiences, will continue to be the predominant language. And traditionally, that's the way it has gone. Um, there were times where other languages have been very influential or very relevant or prominent, um, either nationally or regionally. Nationally with German, or regionally with Polish in the Chicago area, for example, um, or French or other languages. Um, but with that being said, there's all these other people here, and their children end up speaking English in the long run anyway. Now they may learn the language that their parents or grandparents came with as well. For example, I have an interest in learning Ukrainian because my grandparents on my dad's side were Ukrainian, and so I have an interest in learning Ukrainian. I also have an interest in learning Spanish because I took a couple of years of Spanish. So I had the opportunity and the privilege to go to Spanish-speaking countries, like on a business trip or elsewhere, or for other reasons, and it was very exciting, very fun to actually try and practice my Spanish. I had a very limited Spanish. My Spanish is very limited. It's very short. I have a very I don't speak a lot of Spanish, but the little I could speak, I was happy to try, and people were appreciative of that, and it was a lot of fun. And that being said, though, I don't know if how much of a Hispanic country the United States could be. Um, I like to also bring up another thing, which is there's a lot of things I could bring up, but the one thing I want to bring up too is also the idea that like just because the United States could become a Hispanic country, that doesn't automatically mean it'll be the same place as Mexico. That doesn't mean it's going to be the same place as Guatemala. It doesn't mean it's going to be the same place as Colombia or Argentina or Chile or Peru or Ecuador or El Salvador. You know, these are all different places still. These places all have their differences. Even if they're minor differences, they still have their differences. You know, um, you have to remember. It's the same thing with Spain, by the way. You have to remember that, like, we're talking about a bunch of different places, a bunch of different peoples here. That's the problem. That's the main problem with using a term like Hispanic is even if the United States becomes Hispanic, what exactly is that going to look like? What exactly does that even mean? Like, It's not going to look like Mexico. It's not going to look like other places 100%. It would still be its own thing, its own identity, its own background. Um, and that's assuming that even happens. Like, for all we know, there could be a decline in Spanish influence. Um, there could be a bunch of different things. People of Spanish speaking background could also lose interest in it, or they could, or their descendants may not care to speak Spanish as much in the United States because English is still going to be a very predominant language as well. English also has a lot of benefits to learn as well, including international business, more so than Spanish at this point. That may change in the future. But I think that I think it's possible. I think it is possible, but like I think we have to also understand what exactly the word Hispanic means. We have to actually look at other examples of Hispanic countries and their histories and the peoples that have lived there and currently live there. Um, I mean, the other thing too is those other countries that are considered Hispanic. Again, they are Hispanic. At least one of the big reasons why they're Hispanic is because the Spanish Empire colonized those places. That's a big reason. Like all these places, if you look up a map of, if you go and find a map of like what's considered Hispanic countries, you notice that a lot of these countries are they are these are all parts they all are in some form a former part of the Spanish Empire, and then you got Spain there too included. Like if you just Google Hispanic country, all these countries here: Peru, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Cuba, Costa Rica. The few exceptions are Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, but Puerto Rico is also part of Spain. Puerto Rico is also part of the Spanish Empire, and it was one of the last parts of the Spanish Empire. And the United States actually took it from Spain as part of the Spanish American War. So yeah, um, I don't know. I think it's hard to like like I know I'm being a dead horse here. I'm tired. And I know I'm keeping this going on for a while, but like, can a country become a Hispanic country just by Spanish speaking people, immigrating to that country and becoming a sizable part of the country's speaking population? Um, because traditionally, a lot of these countries, maybe even all of them, are Hispanic because of Spain directly coming in and colonizing and settling these places. Spain obviously it would be very hard for them to do that with the United States, especially in the year 2023 or in recent or in near future. So I suppose you can also change the definition. You can change the way a country can be Hispanic, but I would argue that traditionally speaking, a country became Hispanic because of Spain itself influencing the country by colonization or settlements or other influences. Um, but we shall see. Yeah, I think also part of it just depends on people's perceptions and their understanding of the word Hispanic or the word Latino, because again, like from my point of view, a lot of my fellow Americans do not fully understand or grasp what those words even mean. Like to them, they have a very um, they have a very simplified idea of what a Hispanic person is or what a Latino person is. I've even said I've even heard it from people in my life who've said things like, "Oh, that person didn't look Hispanic," and I've had to explain to them like, That's not what that means. Or a Hispanic person can look like this, or an Hispanic person can look like that. They don't have to just look like, a stereotypical, like, super tan, like olive, or like very super tan, like brownish color, skin tone, whatever, you know, of an indigenous mixed race background. They don't have to. You don't have to be that to be Hispanic. Hispanic. I can be Hispanic. Okay, like if I was born in Mexico and I spoke. I mean, if I'm from Mexico, I would be speaking Spanish right now. So, um, if I was born and raised in one of these Hispanic countries, I would definitely be Hispanic. I am curious though about, if I was to move to one of these countries, like Argentina, Mexico, Chile, and I gain citizenship in one of these countries, can I then be considered as Hispanic, especially if I can speak fluent Spanish? Am I considered Hispanic then? Or do I have to be born in these places and then come to the United States? I think that's also an interesting question to ask, because based on what I understand, it's people from those Hispanic countries that move to the United States are then considered Hispanic. That's a term used for that. But yeah. So see, even I don't fully know all this stuff, but like I could tell here that Munzar Z, or Mr. Z, didn't even fully understand everything he was talking about too, because he's using terms interchangeably. He uses Brazil as an example in a video about in a video titled "Will the United States Become a Hispanic Country?" And that gives me the impression that he doesn't even fully know that he may not even know that Brazil is not a Hispanic country. Because Brazil is not Hispanic. Brazil is a Latin American country, but it's not a Hispanic country. It's Latin American because it shares the Latin language tree, family tree, the Romance language branch with Portuguese, but it's not. That's not Spanish, of course. Um, anyway, I'm gonna wrap up this video. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. This is a great way. I hope you all listen to this with maybe playing some video games or just chilling out and listening to this. Um, and take care, everyone. All right, ending the stream soon, and bye bye.